Today we're showcasing some singers that some people may know, some people may not. I'm sure at least one or two of them people do know very well. But they are, we've kind of brought them together based on repertoire, kind of, and also based on contrast of repertoire. We're going to be hearing the same excerpt sung by all four of these singers, and we'll also hear three of them singing the same spiritual. We're going to talk a little bit about spirituals later on because it's a really, really fascinating form, and also it's very closely tied to the kind of the particular role and the particular situation of African American performers in opera and in classical music and that history. The spiritual is very intimately tied to that in very, very interesting ways, even though of course it has its own very different origin.
Kind of kick off this video, I just kind of want to acknowledge that our goal here is sort of to just bring some of these voices to the forefront, voices that maybe aren't always included in the narrative, voices that are not always included on like the top playlists, if you will. And you know, a video of this style is one exactly like we've done in the past, like listening to different singers sing the same pieces. It sort of fits our aesthetic, but again, just picking out singers that maybe are sometimes overlooked, and there are different ways to kind of unpack that. But essentially, opera, whether on stage or off stage, is sort of problematic. As we've kind of reckoned with both our industry issues and issues within the genre and kind of the different expectations we put on voices, it's been really lovely to kind of discover new voices too, or voices of the past that I've never heard before or been exposed to.
What's really interesting in some ways is that opera is having a reckoning now, but it's also an art form that has been having a reckoning for a long time in certain ways, right? And it's always been sort of like, you know, sort of it's an area in which particularly African American performers, including those that we're talking about today, have really shined, even though despite all of those obstacles, right? And in, you know, sort of breaking down barriers sort of increasingly over time, and it's a struggle, and it's a struggle that goes back quite a long time and has a very interesting history and a lot of very interesting singers. And at the end, we'll mention a few sort of resources to, if you're interested in more of that.
The first singer that we're going to talk about today is Mattiwilda Dobbs, and she was actually the first Black singer to sing at La Scala and the first to receive a long-term contract and a leading role, I should say, too, at the Metropolitan Opera, and also the first Black singer to have a leading role at San Francisco Opera. So really just kind of at the forefront of breaking through that barrier. She was originally from Atlanta, Georgia, but her studies and her career, of course, took her internationally. And she at one point even studied with Pierre Bernac and Lotte Lenya for a little bit of time. Some of her most well-known roles include Gilda and Rigoletto, Olympia and Count Hoffmann, Lucia, Zerlina, Oscar and Ballo, Blanchien, all the standard tour fare. She was seemingly always like raising that bar. And she openly refused to sing for segregated audiences, actually. And though she admits that this may have hurt her career at some times, she was just determined to be this strong advocate. And she was actually the daughter of a really influential civil rights activist as well. And kind of tying into that, in 1989, she actually was elected to the board of the directors at the Metropolitan Opera. So, again, always wanting to be a leader in the industry.
So of course, the question with this excerpt is one or two breaths. It really boils down to that. This is a phrase, right, that has two parts. It's evenly divided between the four singers we're showcasing today, where two of them pick up especially that first part that is the hardest part of the phrase, right? They divide it into two breaths, and then two of them don't. Mattiwilda Dobbs is doing it in one breath. think that it's very interesting for different reasons, and one of them is she likes to make those sounds float a little bit, right? So what she does is, if you pay attention to the way she goes up to those notes, both of them, she does a little like a sforzato, like she starts a little loud and then gets soft really quick. She's creating like her own effect that's not written at all. It's just written piano in the score. And speaking of the score, I might mention that this moment has kind of been turned into this kind of like show-stopping, time-stopping moment of kind of just, you know, a high voice kind of like stopping time and just sitting up there. But it actually really isn't that originally in the score. It really is just written at kind of like a quarter note equals 60, which is, you know, pretty moderate tempo. It's been sort of lengthened to allow these coloraturas to showcase their breath control, among other things, their ability to kind of sit on top, you know, and then keep going without taking a breath, or you know, or take a breath, you know, sort of like discreetly. As we'll see, it's actually very interesting how that works for two of them.
I just wanted to touch on what you said actually about how this phrase has become sort of this famous moment, right? And I know the first time I looked at this piece, and I should clarify, I do not sing it, because in this first moment I looked at it and I went, okay, well, so that's not exactly what's on the page, but there's almost like this expectation, this like pressure, if you will, to make it this like glorious moment. And I was like, I'm not ready for this. I was like, I'll put it away until I'm ready to do it properly and like with this, you know, amazing control. And I think that's exactly what we're hearing here, right? That you're able to float up there and make those really intentional decisions to be a little louder or draw back and have that control. It's just so impressive and beautiful.
This doesn't have to be that. It's just become this kind of time-stopping moment that also makes it, of course, much harder. Then there's like pressure, because then it sort of builds up. And that's what's interesting in comparing these performances, even within just a few singers. Obviously, this has been sung by many different kinds of singers, but to hear sort of how they echo each other and almost, I mean, I don't think this is being done consciously, but there's almost like a little bit of a one-upping, right? There's a little bit of like contrast, just these minor contrasts, basically in the same interpretation, very similar interpretations of this moment, because that's become kind of the standard. Overall, I think she demonstrates that sense of control, and that's what's very interesting about this moment, right? It's that sense of like creating that expectation in the audience that it's going to be a little dangerous because I'm taking my time. And then am I gonna take a breath? And then also, even if I do, am I able to like expand, to like keep this going? And we're gonna hear, particularly with one of our, perhaps the more very famous ladies we'll be discussing later, how she does it, because I think that it's just stunning. And spoiler alert, we're actually all looking, with one exception only, at live performances, which bring up some interesting things about how these works are, how these pieces are prepared by the singers and with the conductors and that kind of thing. And we'll touch upon that.
Oh, what a beautiful city! Oh, what a beautiful city! Oh, what a beautiful city! To the city, hallelujah!
I chose this particular spiritual because I was looking for something that all of these ladies had sung at some point. But I just want to briefly in here talk a little bit about the spiritual, just why it's so central to the repertoire of these singers, not just the ones we're talking, but really pretty much all African-American classically trained performers. The spiritual as a musical genre that is known to a larger public, that history begins after the Civil War, because that's when spirituals were first collected, and there's actually an early collection of the first notated spirituals. Starting from that moment, right? Obviously, the spirituals originally were very different from the various forms in which we know them today. They were sort of orally transmitted music that had existed sort of for generations, and it was not in a fixed form. They started to be notated after the Civil War, because actually out of an effort to preserve that to some extent, right? And this is worth pointing out because it's something that is around the same time, is that you see this phenomenon also in for instance, in Western Europe and Eastern Europe also, with sort of the way that like folk, what is this construction of folk genres, but they end up being used in classical art, kind of academic music, right? And you see it in composers like Dvorak, and their sort of almost a kind of appropriation of folk music, which is partly misrepresenting it in some ways, but is also sort of putting it into a forum that it wouldn't have either, and also bringing it into a kind of a dialogue with a different kind of music that otherwise it wouldn't have. And I mentioned Dvorak because Dvorak is also, he went to the United States, and he is someone who thought that, there's a famous statement he made about the spiritual as being the original form, or sort of like the main form of American folk music, right? And this was already a time when spirituals were starting to be understood in that sense. They were being sung at that time primarily in choral arrangements, partly through the influence of the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s. They start to be included in the regular repertoire of famous concert singers like the tenor Roland Hayes, the bass baritone Paul Robeson, who I'm sure people have heard of. He's very, Marian Anderson, of course, we're getting more later into sort of more familiar territory. But they start to be included into the concert repertoire together with other concert repertoire pieces, German lieder, all these kinds of things. The arrangers also of the spirituals come into play here. I think that for this particular one, in both examples, we'll be hearing an arrangement by Edward Boatner, who is one of the classic arrangers of these spirituals. And it's interesting sort of to mention or to think of that background a little bit in looking at the difference in some of these performances, right? Because it points to this kind of like very unique kind of genre that the spiritual is, right? It's not necessarily a classical genre per se. Well, actually, it isn't originally, but it has a very specific place within that repertoire, specifically of these singers.
And I think learning about the roots of the style of song is quite important, so that it is appreciated, not appropriated. That if for whatever reason you're singing one, when it comes down to like arrangements of it did really change through styles, and it has become a really important part of recital repertoire for many people. And I think it was also a way to program works that they could like claim their identity through. That you're seeing a whole program of dead white European men, and then you get to have like your own work that you can showcase your culture, your heritage, your identity through. And I think that's really important. And I do think too, you mentioned like they all sing it a little differently. But some of them have a music theater background, some of them have a jazz background, and that's all brought into this style that isn't just classical. And yes, of course, there are classical arrangements of spirituals, and of course, those are the ones we see on recital programs. But it's just letting those songs be influenced by everything that they are. I mean, you see a really powerful performance of a spiritual, you're just so moved, and because there's so much that comes with that, like knowing the history, knowing the culture. It's not just a song.
What's interesting with Mattiwilda Dobbs' rendition, I think, of this is, for me, we'll hear that she's actually singing the same arrangement as Barbara Hendricks, but the style is very different, or it comes across somehow a bit differently. Hers, to me, sounds like it's there's a strong kind of art song influence to it. It's very, very clear in the diction. There's a very strong sort of transmission of affect, of a specific affect. At the same time, she's not like, it's not like interpretive, right? She's not like art song. A lot of times, and depending on the singer, can get very, very personal. And I don't feel that she's doing that. On the contrary, I feel that she's sort of, kind of standing and singing. It's like and it's in this arrangement. It's interesting that they both use the same arrangement, even though it's tweaked kind of stylistically. Because when you notice with both of these singers, and this is to do with their voice type, that actually it suits them very well vocally. Both of them, they're singing in B flat, but a lot of times this particular version will sit on the F at the very top of the staff. Which is very comfortable for especially a kind of a lighter voice, just to sit, not necessarily, you can go as high as you want, but to sort of sit for a long time and pay attention to how clear her vowels are, even though it's a little high, and how she uses that area of her voice to kind of transmit this kind of like, this sense of like, sort of happiness at this, at this sight of the beautiful city.
Another American coloratura soprano who actually had her start on Broadway, and kind of from there she met a lot of the New York household names when it comes to Broadway. And so one that immediately comes to mind is Leonard Bernstein, and she actually performed in his first production of West Side Story, and he really took a liking to her and ended up inviting her to perform as the soloist in a lot of pretty high profile concert gigs with these like top level orchestras. And then inevitably through that she went on to work with like Pierre Boulez and Nadia Boulanger and like all these huge premiere halls. But her operatic debut was at Santa Fe Opera, starting with what became one of her staple roles, which is Adele and Die Fledermaus. And her other famous roles became like Queen of the Night, Blanchine, Gilda, Adina, Oscar, Manon, Olympia. One cool anecdote is that she was actually invited on Stravinsky's own personal invite to sing in his opera The Nightingale. The list is rounded out by her rendition of Sophie and Rosenkavalier. And she went on to have, a huge international career singing at Royal Opera House, Glyndebourne, Vienna, and of course the Metropolitan Opera.
And in many places where she was singing, she was the first Black singer to be performing those roles, certainly in those places. Yeah, absolutely.
Raising the bar every time. And she taught in Indiana, and she was faculty at some of like the really top young artist programs in the United States and through Europe as well.
Excerpt is actually from a live Vienna performance in 1968 where she's conducted by Bernstein. She does it in 2 breaths. I have to say, I find that she in her affect in this moment to me reads a little bit as like very excited, which is actually appropriate for the moment, right? Like Sophie is being presented with the rose. I certainly would be excited to get a silver rose, but we're also listening to singers who take an approach of more like really just stillness and just kind of sort of luxuriating in the moment, which is to say like their own voices, basically, right? I mean, as we all are, right? So I find that she's a little bit, so it's a little bit different. I find her interpretation, she's pushing those notes a little bit sharp. There's like a fast vibrato. There's like an energy to it almost. I have to say I prefer the more sort of like, where it's like showcasing that just that virtuosity and that total mastery, which is not to say that she isn't. She's just doing it sort of in a different way. So she does do it in 2 breaths, and that also like that takes it's harder actually to do it that way from a musical standpoint because you're already chopping it up a little bit. And to me, she already has that, like she's ready to go. Like I'm ready. It's like a little bit. What's especially interesting is to compare hearing her in this range, right? Sort of. The high B, we're close to high C. And we're going to hear her in an excerpt that is not a spiritual because, again, she didn't really perform them frequently to my knowledge. But she is singing at the very bottom of her range, especially as a coloratura soprano. She's singing somewhere from Bernstein's West Side Story, which is a song that she introduced. She was in the original cast. And this is the original cast recording. And it's very interesting to hear how she negotiates that bottom half of her range here.
she came from this Broadway background, and she had some really cool, like she has some really cool credits on that resume from her Broadway days. So having that extra side to, incorporate and, approach music with is really special. And I think kind of gives her own stamp on all of that too, right? That you can listen to it and be like, oh yeah, that's hers.
Absolutely, and I just find it's very interesting to hear. She's obviously that's a studio recording, so you hear her sort of approaching those low B's. She's singing a low, very. She's exactly 2 octaves below the Rosenkavalier excerpt. This is not like the money area for this kind of soprano, so it's interesting to hear how she kind of negotiates that and singing so low, and it still sounds very, very lovely. Perhaps more as she goes up in the kind of the mid range, right? And the low B's, it's interesting to hear how some of them they sound different. It's very, very interesting to just hear that kind of cleanliness of intonation and also just production, in that register. Because we don't, when there's a lot of high stuff going on, we pay less attention to that, even just as listeners. So I find that a very interesting comparison.
Next up, we have the infamous and renowned Kathleen Battle, who I feel in some ways doesn't need any introduction. But of course, not just an opera star, but highly recognized for her interpretations of concert work, of art songs, and of course her performances of the Mozart soprano roles. So Susanna, Pamina, Zerlina, Blanchien, Despina, all of those. And of course, she wasn't just limited to the Mozart, having sung pretty much all of the staple coloratura roles that we've mentioned. Despite her acclaim and sort of vocal finesse, she's perhaps better known to many as being a diva. And there's this infamous, I guess is the best word, incident that, she was fired from the Met in 1994. And she did return actually for the first time in 2016 for a concert of spirituals. And this is sort of an anecdote I've always kind of wrestled with. It's a great story. We all know anecdotes of the, I survived the battle. But it begs the question sometimes, would the same reaction have happened if it was a white soprano, if it was a tenor? Why was it that her career was so like widely marred and kind of like painted with this brush of, oh, she's a diva? And especially in the time right now where like even in pop music we like celebrate divas. We're like, look at this persona, look at this identity, look at this caricature. And that's kind of what it is, the expectation of a character of being like an opera diva, right? So the idea that this persona that she had or didn't have, or is what parts of it are almost urban legend and what parts of it are real. That line of healthy workplace behavior that opens another can of worms. But if you go to that place, there are of course hundreds of other singers, maybe not hundreds, but there are singers out there, particularly tenors, particularly male singers, who have had bad track records, who have been inappropriate in the workplace. That's still working, right? And for her to have just been like vilified for this persona that in many ways I think was expected of her, that was kind of anticipated for the soprano lead to have this diva attitude. And again, if it was anyone else, would they have been vilified the same way? I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there, but it's just something I've always wondered when we're talking about her in particular, because the voice is just...
The voice and the singing.
Yes.
The voice and the singing, right? And it's really evident in this Rosenkavalier excerpt. I think this is probably the reason why I chose this particular excerpt. We're not choosing winners here, but if we were, this is maybe my favorite rendition of this moment ever. She performed Sophie at the Met, as far as I know, only in this one run in 1986. She was actually, the reviewer actually said, is she the best Sophie who has ever sung at the Met? And that's a very reasonable question, I have to say. Even if you go back, And just even from on the basis of this moment, which literally is, you know, like maybe 5 minutes after she's actually started singing in the whole, because Sophie only comes in the second act, and she has to compete with the orchestra, kind of screeching the arrival of the Rosenkavalier. Excitement, 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 and then here you have to be like, you know, draw back for a second. That's what makes our breath stop, right? When we, as listeners. So I think the way she does this with the two breaths, I think it's you know, there's no break. There's just that she breathes, you know, she's breathing, but there's no break, and that's when you're really like holding your breath, because like how is this going to work, right? How is it going to be? How are you going to? Because you're, you know, that's that weird thing about these moments. They're actually they draw a lot of attention to themselves. It's like, what, you know, it's kind of time stopping, but also there's a lot of like excitement, but like not for the singer. That's not what she's conveying. She's conveying mastery. We're the ones who are kind of like almost nervous for her, right? And that's what makes it into this kind of like, there's a spectator sport element to it, which it's interesting to see how that's even in a moment that is not written to be virtuosic, but becomes one. And there's that element to opera that people complain about and have always, you know, but it's there, you know, that is, you know, it's sort of, there's an element of sort of display. And in moments like this, where that display is appropriate to the moment, which I think this absolutely is, right? In all four of the examples that we're looking at, then I think, you know, all the better, right? This also points out to me something. It's interesting, speaking about like, well, you know, people who have been sort of banned from opera. You know, she's conducted here by James Levine, and it's interesting to hear something that a lot of people talked about, people who worked with him and singers that they did say that he was always sort of there with them, and they had that sense. Whatever one's opinions of James Levine, I do sort of feel that in this moment. I do feel that there is, because this is an interesting moment that points up not only the singer's own preparation, so how they've chosen to do it and whether they've really sort of worked that to make sure it's going to happen on stage, you know, and not just be sort of like, well, you know, who knows what's going to happen. You have to know, it's too exposed, right? But also that the conductor's with them in terms of the pacing, in terms of, you know, otherwise the singer could be, imagine if the singer's thrown for a loop, right? They've done their work, but then so that requires a lot of, you know, working in rehearsal and making sure, and knowing and having that confidence that it's gonna come through, and that the two people will be able to work together. And I do hear that in this performance, and I do think that that's perhaps one of its advantages. I don't know that she recorded this role in the studio or even sang it that much. So this is actually the only example I know of her Sophie, and it's very, very stunning, I think, for all those reasons.
What a beautiful sea! Oh, what a beautiful sea! Oh, what a beautiful sea! 12 years to the city, hallelujah! My beautiful city, the city is just so far, the city.
This spiritual actually comes from another example, also conducted by James Levine, but it gives us an opportunity to bring in another singer who's not really in our sort of on topic today, but well, sort of, but not, you know, not a coloratura for sure, but you know, just as famous as if not more, you know, as Kathleen Battle. And so they did a concert together of spirituals in New York Carnegie Hall in 1990, and this is from that concert. It's the only instance I could find of Kathleen Battle singing this music. She sang spirituals all the time, and included them in a very sort of, in the sort of traditional fashion on her concert sort of programs as a rule. But this particular one, no, not as a solo item, but it did appear in this concert, which gives you already a different sense of the styles of spiritual arrangement. Not only it's arranged for two singers, this is a very different arrangement from the other two we've heard in other pieces on this program they sang with choir sometimes. So you see like how this, which gives so many different possibilities for sort of stylistic reference, and it's interesting to compare the style of the two, right? Even though they're two different singers. And what I really find interesting here, thinking of how, let's say, Mattiwilda Dobbs sang it, or it's interesting that Kathleen Battle also, to me, and I think this is one of her kind of real, sort of something that really we should pay attention to, which she sings out. She sings big. And it doesn't matter that she has a light voice, or that she has a light voice, or that she has a high voice. And she can really stand her own against Jessie Norman. It's really interesting in this moment, right? She is singing, she is not playing the kind of light coloratura kind of like, she's not playing that vocal type. She is singing out. And again, this is not because, this has nothing to do with the fact of singing spirituals. Actually, in some ways, this is kind of what we want to hear always, Although, what it is in contrast to is, of course, the Rosenkavalier excerpt. That's not a big singing moment, right? That's everything else that we've said it was.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention too, similar to what you said, that she sang spirituals a lot, like in a solo recital context and in concerts. And because she did so much concert work, she sort of slotted them in when she could, and it became sort of like an on-brand thing for her that she often performed them. Really lovely to see her shine in that style, and sort of like perfected her own aesthetic for them, I think. So Barbara Hendricks, our next singer featured here, an American soprano, but really solidified her European connection, I guess, and has lived in Europe since 1977. And similar to some of our other examples, she really shone sort of in the European scene, making her professional debut at Glyndebourne. She sang at Paris Opera, La Scala, among many others. But of course, the Met. It always comes back to the Met. But interesting here, her Met debut was Rosenkavalier. And also really something interesting I found when she started singing kind of like later in life, and later being 19. But that is sort of like a later in the process for many sopranos, but it didn't slow her down at all. So she performed over 20 roles, recorded over half of those. And then on the side, also like really shone in film and musical theater and jazz and all these other things. And like, I think that's pretty amazing. And kind of like Kathleen Battle, she also has these really well-known interpretations of art song and concert repertoire, but also is a really well-known like leader and activist. And she's actually a goodwill ambassador to the United Nations, and has been really devoted to doing humanitarian work and using her voice to promote human rights causes. And I just think that's pretty incredible.
It is. And turning to her, and in relation to the other singers we've talked about, actually, she probably has the fullest kind of voice. She really probably would sound almost be better categorized as a lyric soprano, although there is a certain amount of intersection of repertoire, and she sang coloratura kind of repertoire and pieces. She sang very, very varied repertoire. She sang a lot of Baroque music, oratorio, these kinds of things. So also very diverse in that sense, right? In terms of the ability to sort of to adapt to different styles and sort of absorb them. A very fun fact about Barbara Hendricks is that she did start late, partly I believe because her parents didn't want her to go into an artistic profession. Originally had sort of pushed her in a different direction, but she was, when she went to Juilliard, and she was actually selected for the Maria Callas masterclasses, so she can be heard in the recordings of those. I'm not sure what she learned there, but she's a very different singer. Excerpt, she really you can hear there's more of a fullness on the top there. This is an interesting situation. I think it's probably the fastest tempo, where she's conducted here by Bernard Haitink. It's a studio recording because I wasn't able to find her Zophie live. Would have been interesting to compare because all of the others are, and it's a very interesting moment, particularly to hear live. Her approach to this moment is interesting because it is in the studio. I think it's a little bit affected by that, and she does do it in one breath. It's a little bit faster tempo. For whatever reason, whether that was at her instigation or Haitink's, it's hard. I mean, there's no way to know that. But She takes those the A sharp, the B. It's fuller. It's a bigger sound. It's a little louder. It's a little close to forte, right? It's a fuller kind of sound. This moment and this part overall maybe don't seem as suited to her for that reason. I think she's pushing the kind of the lyric territory just vocally. She has a very interesting kind of vocal timbre that you really hear. There's like a kind of there's like something. Remember we talked about Edda Moser and I said it was like smoky. I don't think that's the case in I wouldn't use that word for Barbara Hendricks, but there's something a little breathy, not in a bad sense, not in like bad like breath vibrato or something like that, but like there's like something like a little extra kind of a kind of a color or something, and you hear it really when she kind of is going between notes, not so much in the top, although her top is very beautiful as well, very kind of full sound lyric sound there. I think that this moment is maybe not the most suited to her. By contrast, I actually find that this particular spiritual suits her like a glove.
Oh, what a beautiful city! Oh, what a beautiful city! Oh, what a beautiful city! 12 gates unto the city. Hallelujah! Oh, what a beautiful city! Oh, what a beautiful city! Oh, what a beautiful city! 12 gates unto the city. Hallelujah!
She inflects it with a much more kind of a there's like a maybe a slightly more bluesy kind of, if you can hear they actually take a slower tempo, but she is rhythmically much freer. There still is that element of like big singing. What I shouldn't use that because I always like everything good is like big singing. That's what I. But there is that element of like it's those high those Fs at the top of the staff. They're ringing out very nicely. She takes a B flat at the end.
My Lord built that city, and he said it was just a far square, and he said he wanted you sinners to meet him in the air. 12 gates, 12 gates, hallelujah.
There's a little bit of the kind of like those more sort of like almost like a slightly kind of maybe a gospel influence also. I mean, spirituals have been sung also not just by classical singers. They were also sung as solo repertoire, let's say, by singers of from all kinds of different sort of musical areas. And so there Mahalia Jackson sang spirituals in a kind of a gospel more sort of influence, obviously because that was her area. And I think there's a little bit of that going on with Barbara Hendricks as well. And there's just a very different feel to it, but that I think is very nice. It's very interesting, kind of melding the kind of the classical spiritual because they're still singing that same sort of concert arrangement of it. But then the way that she gives it something very very special that I think is very very interesting, very worth hearing.
Yeah, and kind of like I was saying earlier, tying in all of her background in jazz and other styles, and just really putting her own stamp on it. It's pretty special.
We're losing you visually.
I know. I'm descending into darkness. I'll make a joke about it.
I'm already laughing. Go ahead, make your joke.
I said very little the last two because I've been so aware that I started filming with beautiful sunlight. I've been slowly descending into darkness. As the sun sets here in my home in Nova Scotia, the sun is also setting on this video. It is coming to a close. So I just wanted to throw out there are some really wonderful resources and even like social media accounts are going to be two of the ones that I mentioned. One of them being at Black Women in Opera, who often do really amazing features of current Black singers featuring historical Black singers. If you want more of this content, just sort of like daily, I really do recommend it. Another is at Opera is Racist, and that is more on a serious note, but it really does show some of the problematic and systemic harm that is kind of within our industry in opera. And singers that have left, their own anecdotes of their own experiences, and I think all of them are pretty important to acknowledge when, especially when unpacking these amazing, wonderful singers and their careers, like the amount of things that they probably went through to persevere, and that the hurdles that they overcame to be featured in the way that we're even talking about them today.
There's a YouTube channel called Black Opera Live. This creator, he features a lot of very interesting singers and talks about a lot of sort of issues attendant to those singers, of the past and of the present. I definitely recommend his channel. And then two singers actually that I think would be an interesting resource. Angel Blue has a channel, which she's kind of interesting. It's I don't know that it's necessarily focused on just those kinds of serious issues. She also interviews other singers, and there's a lot, but I think it's a very interesting channel. She's an interesting kind of figure and personality, I think. And also Lawrence Brownlee, the tenor, has a channel where he does, I think, some of the same kinds of things on the wider internet, there is because I talked about spirituals. There's a wonderful resource just called the Spirituals Database, which I'll link down. There's a website called Afrocentric Voices in Classical Music. It's a very interesting website that has a lot of biographical detail. It actually also covers composers, which is obviously my area, so it's of particular interest if you're from that sort of field, that I will link below. This is a very interesting, and it has very detailed biographies and also links to other sort of resources if you really want to get in depth into any one of these figures. Some unknown but very, very interesting figures who really made a mark, at least in their time and sort of in their environment as they could. So I definitely recommend checking that out. Morgan is slowly vanishing. She's doing a slowly vanishing act. So thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed, and of course, as always, tell us if whom within this category, let's say of Sophie, maybe we left someone out. I don't know that I couldn't think of, or couldn't find. So let us know about that. Remember to like and subscribe, and we will join you again next time for our next video, whatever that will be.